Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back for another space. Uh, I know it's been a kind of succession the last couple of days, but this space was absolutely necessary, in my opinion. It's a simple commentary on something that is absolutely um, unhinged and which seems to further accelerate right now. For now, it's just words, of course, and those words have a meaning, they have an origin, they have a reason. We are speaking about the latest piece on War on the Rocks from one member or scholar from the RUSI, so the Royal University of Warfare Bullshit in the UK, England, and then the usual Michael Kaufman, which, as you know, has multiple hats and collaborates with multiple people on the west side of this craziness and has been wrong for now 2.5 years for almost everything. Almost everything. The piece is called Willpower, Not Manpower, is Europe's main limitation for a force in Ukraine. And it's actually pretty bad. Like everything on the piece seems to have been written without taking into account anything that has happened the last 18 months in Ukraine, let alone 3 years. The problem that I'm having with this piece is that at the same time, another group of pro-Ukrainian Western authors, the Blackbird group, has been extremely vocal on the fact that Ukraine is losing the war. And the only thing that we can do, we in the sense of the Europeans, the Westerners, can do is to choose which pill we want to take, which is try and go for a ceasefire without, you know, limiting ourselves to the same nonsense of legal borders, just and durable peace, which is just a mantra. It doesn't mean anything. You cannot have a just durable peace the way Europeans envision it, which is the return of the whole of the Ukrainian territory from its independence, because the situation on the ground literally leads to ignoring the losses, the huge problems that Ukraine is facing, and of course it's also ignoring why suddenly we have the situation with Trump, why we have the situation with the Europeans that want a bigger participation, etc., etc., etc. So let's completely start. The piece dates from the 3rd of March 2025, and it is something that was prepared beforehand, given the way Trump had been carrying himself in regards to Ukraine. But right now, the problem was that, as you may remember, on Friday, Trump dressed down Cocaine Man in the worst possible way by first humiliating him when he welcomed him at the White House, making him feel the wrath of roughly the whole of the campaign, where Zelensky sometimes openly, sometimes a bit more carefully went against Trump, especially given the position that Trump had taken over the war, the accusation of Zelensky being a thief, a con man, warmonger, that he wasn't doing anything, and later on, after he was elected and sworn in, we had the dictator, we had the approval rate being at 4%, etc., etc., etc. Now, the situation since the Friday has escalated in many ways, but the most pregnant one has been the announcement that Trump has both halted the financing of the weapons purchase program which in fact had been more or less disbursed during the Biden tenure. And of course, the most recent announcement of opposing the shipment and transfer of absolutely every single piece of equipment and weaponry and supplies from the US to the Ukrainian state. And this not only the outshipping from the US, but also distribution from the transit point in Poland and Germany. This, of course, had for direct result to make Zelensky, I think everybody read it, do a 180, and after he had clearly said that he wouldn't be gunning for a ceasefire, now he made a volte-face and said, like, okay, under the formation was extremely hilarious because it felt like some old communist Albanian autocriticism when he said under the glorious leadership or something along those lines about Trump. And of course, then he splashed the plan for which we are having this commentary, and the plan as laid out by the French and the Brits regards a three-step movement. First of all, in a way or another, within a month, both sides will have to agree or will agree to stopping the air campaign. The air campaign, which on the Ukrainian side is mostly long range via drone assets and frontline with aircraft, drones, and the localized attack by either the makeshift cruise missiles, drones, the way they call them, or with more suicide unmanned aircraft. Now, the problem with this, as I said, is that this trade is absolutely stupid. And it is stupid for one main reason. And that reason is, in this air war, despite a lot of nonsense that has been spewed by many on both sides, we can go back to Fighter Boomer, or we can go back to the claims by the Ukrainian OKW, the Pigro OKW, and we end up with more or less the same, is that despite many flaws, the air campaign on the Russian side is wrecking some cogs in the Ukraine mechanic because it has been a clear problem, and there's still a NATO hackathon ongoing, which should be having results by the 19th of March on how to counter UMPKs. There have been multiple hackathons on how to stop the localized ISR, which of course doesn't work, by the way, for many reasons. The biggest of them is that both sides can manage to produce thousands of these ISR drones, which means that the current level of attrition for both sides, which is at best a couple per day, between 3 and 8 or 3 and 10, depending on who you listen, just simply isn't enough to stop the ISR from working. What is enough is that you can show how you shoot down Russian or Ukrainian drones, and in the case of the Ukrainians, given that PR is integral part of their fighting strategy, you have this feeling that, oh my God, this is so bad. They destroyed about 1,700 of these Russian drones over 8 months. This, of course, once again, are Ukrainian numbers, which especially for drones, I usually divide by 2. But even if you were into a full mode, that would mean about 7 to 8 per day. split into the all areas of activity, which in the worst case scenario can be 4, and the best case scenario can be 8 to 10. And it's not very complicated. You can check. You get one zone in Kursk, another zone in Volchansk, a third zone in and around the Kupiansk area, another zone around Terni, a sixth zone over Chasovia, a seventh of Toretsk, an eighth in southern Donbass, ninth over Kherson, and a tenth around the Nikolaev Kinburg Spit area. So if you lose 10, one per each zone, you can understand what the problem is. The attrition can look big, but actually it's pretty small. And this once again is losing them day after day in every zone 1, which, as I said, by the calculus that is made, even if you have to take it as it is, it's only about 6, 7 drones, 8 at maximum. So you're gonna have losses on many zones, but not completely at 100% overall. And we can see that this is also extremely right, because more recently the Russians have been showing objective control shots. The longest that we've seen was in Dnipropetrovsk, over 130 kilometers from the contact line. Then we had the one in Komar, not too far from the front, of course, but still it shows that the whole idea of countering those UAVs by FPVs or by this array of defensive drone operator and drone teams doesn't absolutely work each and every time. Now, the biggest problem is that, as I said, the Ukrainians seem to have a huge issue with their own story, because initially this was supposed to reduce the ISR of the Russian Federation, but as with everything in this war, the announcement and the actual facts are very complicated to intermarry and link to each other. In a lot of cases, for instance, you get very intuitive interpretation on how the war is going to go, what's going to happen, and then you end up with a completely different perspective. So, for instance, as I said, we are supposed to believe that the Russian ISR is getting worse and worse because of all the quote-unquote drones that are shown shot down, yet the losses on the Ukrainian side are actually becoming worse and worse, and we are at the highest average level since the beginning of the war. And it's there where, as I said, you have to ask yourself a question. How the fuck does it go that Ukrainians claim the ISR is bad? Keep this in mind, because this is going to be very important for the further commentary on the text. Yet the losses are getting on the wrong side of this equation. Well, as I said, it's pretty simple, because the Ukrainian quote-unquote air defense FPVs cannot be everywhere. They are slow. They need a synchronized detection, which means that they need to know at the exact very moment where that drone is going to be at the perfect point of interception. Because this is one of the things that I say, the problem is that if that drone is going to fish for, let's say, a training ground, like it happened in Dnipropetrovsk, then you need to intercept it before it gets a picture and gives up coordinates, not after. You can show how you shoot this drone after, but meanwhile 130 plus guys just got peppered with cluster ammunition. And allegedly, according to Butazov, 32 are dead. I have another echo, which means about 150 casualties, but half of them are dead. And a big part of them died in hospital, instead of the bullshit that was said that the large majority of the wounded got hospitalized and stabilized within the respective medical institutions. Uh, on a certain case, going at the morgue is also being stable because you're dead. But anyway, jokes aside, let's start with the actual point, which is uh, the main concept of this. The main concept is, as we start, the US wants out of this war, or would like to impose a peace on wrong terms to Zelensky. And given this approach and the certainty that might surround further American help, Europe needs to pick the slack. Until now, it's pretty simple. It's something that we heard for now 4 or 5 months because people were afraid about Trump coming in. And, I mean, to the date, Trump has literally played that role. The role of a literal maverick, as we said initially, with no real guideline, and who has been, at least in words, flipping multiple times from one side to the other. Then, after the shit show in Washington, Zelensky went straight to London, and there he was entertaining this potential mission from multiple members of the EU and NATO to actually enforce a kind of peace within the territory of Ukraine. Now, you need to take this into account because our friends here at War on the Rocks /RUSI Naval Security Studies have a huge problem of understanding because Starmer and Macaroni, they all rely on a legal conundrum, which is we are going there once there is a peace to keep, and therefore there is initially no talk of open intervention. So basically, the whole logic of this is we are going there to keep peace, so stop any further Russian skid that would try to further advance to Ukraine. As such, as I said, this is absolutely unacceptable, and actually both Starmer and Macaroni have said that it would hinge on Russia's approval of the nature of and nationality of the troops. And this is where this whole space actually should be a non-starter. What we are going to discuss here is not the reality where Brits and French have a huge problem with their proposal, which is Russia saying no, and then what if Russia says no, they're not going to agree to the ceasefire. It's pretty simple, actually. It's a catch-22, and in my opinion, it has been proposed knowing pretty well that the Russians would refuse. And the logic of this proposal is not as much to actually enforce it, but to present Trump with, see, we made a peace proposal, the plan is honest, of course it's bullshit, but and it's the rationale that are refusing. And of course there is plenty to discuss about the nonsense presented by Macaroni and Starmer with Zelensky on top. As I said, the Ukrainians are not winning the air war. They are losing it. They know they're losing it, and despite the damages inflicted to Russian oil and gas infrastructure, they are without a common measure. And it's been going so badly that, as I said, more recently, the last 3 to 4 months, people start to feel more and more their rivals. And this is happening not because, suddenly there is more hits. No, it is happening because people are less afraid now to start posting these videos, simply because the logic of fear that had for a long while worked into filming the arrivals and the results of them, is slowly going away. And paradoxically, this is happening because of this feeling that maybe it's not a mirage. The peace, the negotiations are not a mirage. There is a lot of noise around them. There is a lot of things that are not true, but at least you can understand what's going on and where it is going. And it's true. The way the Russian delegation spoke before and after the two rounds of negotiations, you can see that there is a exploratory work in order to bring both parties to a certain position where it would be possible to have some kind of understanding. So far, it has been extremely complicated to achieve this, simply because Trump started with the idea that he was going to handle both sides at the same time. And this is one of his first defeats. When he saw what the position was from Putin and what the position was from Zelensky, then, as I said, he understood that, in my opinion, the first thing he needed to solve was Zelensky. Because Zelensky, and this is how Zelensky proved himself at the White House, has been accustomed from anyone to just get a pass. So when Zelensky yaps about 991 territory, everybody has said, yes, this is our goal. This is what we're going to do. At no point has any, except the few fringe commentators, has said, oh, listen, guys, 991 is out of the question. Even when there has been some kind of water in the wine by saying that it's going to be complicated to get back everything, the political line of everybody has been a just and lasting peace for Ukraine, which, of course, underscores 991 territories. Not 2022, not 2024, not 2015. We are speaking about a implicit point to the initial territory of the state of Ukraine. So basically the one that they got after their sovereignty declaration and the independence vote. Now, this is where exactly you have this issue, which is that you may try and have a maximalist approach so the other side breaks, but to quote Trump, Zelensky doesn't have any card right now. The only cards that he has is just nuisance to the Russians and, of course, a disruptive force when it comes to any kind of negotiation. This is how people have described him, especially when the situation with the deals regarding the strikes during the month of June. Once again, those strikes were supposed to be extremely limited, so it made absolutely no sense to try to compare them with what is being proposed right now by Macaroni and Starmer. However, this is not important because that part of that plan, so first of all, after 1 month is air truce, then after that, a negotiation in order to approve the French and Brits inside, and after that, a kind of tripwire, which meant that if somehow the Russians wanted still to fight, well, the troops over there wouldn't be enough to stop the Russians, but they would be enough to cause some kind of reference to Article 5 of NATO. I'm going to repeat it. This is far from the case because if there is a negotiated aspect where the Russians would accept French and Brits as peacekeepers, they would probably ask for extra nationalities. And there you would see coming in the Chinese and potentially And it would be hilarious, but they're not going to do it. North Koreans or Iranians or Indians, it doesn't really matter. But you can see where this is going. Now, as I said, this makes absolutely no sense. Right now, the Russians have the upper hand, and everybody's recognizing that, even begrudgingly. But the main issue with the Russians having the upper hand is that there is a misconception of where the Russians have the upper hand. Especially because the propaganda on the Ukrainian side now has turned 2 or 3 notches up, to the point that we are speaking about Russians going to assault with donkeys and having no weapons, no ammunition, artillery. It's something that every single day is disproved by facts, by satellite pictures, and by the advancement of the Russian military, generally speaking. Be that in Kursk, where, as you saw recently, guys, the map that I had drawn for you based on Ukrainian claims. And yes, no, guys, there are actual Ukrainians that are giving more or less good information. You need to go and fetch it. And also, you need to filter it from the bullshit. Because if you listen to the bullshit that is being spread, especially by many geolocators, you will miss the reality of combat. And sometimes more mainstream commenters or, military careers on the Korean side let go a couple of things. But most of the time, it is useless because it reflects something that has already been gone. For instance, when Deep State spoke about a very difficult situation on the Kursk salient 4 days ago, we already knew that a bunch of that salient that was quote unquote difficult had already gone. It was gone. And they were forced suddenly to give up 41 square kilometers in Kursk for things that actually happened over 2 weeks. But because of this whole stalling logic that they are trying to keep the appearance up, the make-believe situation that you have with Ukraine, you got the logic where, suddenly a whole part of the pocket, which is almost 1/8 of it, actually 1/8 of it, collapsed overnight. And then it stopped. This is what happens most of the time with Cope State, is that suddenly you end up with 40, 50, 60, 80 square kilometers. Ugledar, for instance, it's absolutely incredible because they hit the situation so bad, and when suddenly Ugledar was half surrounded and the Russians were bypassing it on the west, nobody understood how it was possible. And then once you start checking for bombs, UMPKs, and other data that unfortunately even Andy the Pedo gave up, then you see that these guys were crunching the air for a whole month. But it's a denial, and this denial actually is playing games to people who are making the commentary, like the two retards that have contributed to the following article. Then let's stop calling them retards and just read their piece and give a commentary. So, first of all, the logic is that a European NATO intervention or peacekeeping force is absolutely not fantastical, it's a necessity. And in a certain sense, I would say yes, it is a kind of necessity given how Trump is treating the whole situation, which is with absolute callousness, where he is blackmailing both sides, but this blackmail against Zelensky, given that it's a weaker part and the most dependent part, is an absolute shit show. And honestly, I'm going to be open with you guys. This is exactly how the motto says, being the enemy of America is dangerous, but being its friend is fatal. In this case, it's not really friendship, it's more like a pimp whole relationship. And that's what happened on Friday. The big pimp just smacked the bitch because she was giving him an attitude. And then it voided the credit card, and then it voided the car, the phone, and suddenly the bitch was far more amenable to go and make money for Big Pimpy. And what happened is that, again, a lot of people keep speaking about this mineral deal, and when you read the text, the memorandum actually, because actually it's a memorandum, it's not even, there is nothing in there. You can understand what's going on and what is going to happen. The mechanism that is related in this memorandum is one that Ukraine just cannot feed if both sides need to participate 50-50 on that joint venture. Ukraine doesn't have that money, and specifically it has excluded existing resources from which it draws its revenue. So by that point, if the existing sources are not exploitable, you are speaking about future sources. You are speaking about exploration. You are speaking about investment. You are speaking about a lot of things that simply do not make any money for the Americans in short term, because that's also the problem. The whole mineral deal is just a big IOU, but it's impossible to handle like that because it has to be a joint venture and a 50-50 investment. Ukrainians do not have that money. And I'm going to tell you why. If Trump has to deliver 10 billion worth of weapons, and that thing works upon that joint venture, although the joint venture is supposed to cover investment in extraction and rebuilding in Ukraine. We're not speaking about weapons. This is the funny part. The whole point is that Trump somehow is going to get a huge IOU repayable by natural resources and swathes of Ukrainian land that simply do not exist, or at least at the level that they would be covering within 5 to 10 years anything that Trump is pretending willing to deliver. So the whole mineral deal is just a link up. It's just a way to give something to Trump. And for Trump, initially it was indeed something like he thought, okay, these guys have a lot of rare earth minerals, whatever, and we're gonna milk them a little bit to a certain tune. That's why the whole $500 billion popped out. Because, and this is something that was actually laid out by Pompeo when they first penned the tentative Trump peace plan back during the campaign. That 500 billion, if you read the Pompeo text, is there already. So the whole point from Trump is that someone already spoke to him about how much money you can make by exploiting the Ukrainian underground. This is already a very interesting point if you want to take it, because it's based on nothing. And therefore the whole attitude that gives this situation right now is not a misunderstanding, it's a way for both sides to try to get something despite there being nothing to gain. Trump has already enough funding that has been spent and contracts that are ongoing to actually not do anything and still help them. What Trump wanted, I think, from Zelensky is simply a proof of fealty. Of course, was it predatory? Of course it was predatory. That's the whole point of America. But that part is for the moment gone, and the new part is the Europeans have a plan to stop the fighting and then protect the Ukrainian side and the peace, quote unquote, by deploying troops. And as I said, the plan is first try and make a ceasefire work only on partial fronts. So, as I said, the air power goes away, long range strikes, they go away. And it's very funny because it comes at the moment where Trump literally said they're going to cut most of the help. And this means that part of the deal that made the Ukrainians so efficient, quote unquote, in long range strikes, which is American ISR, American control, and American SIGINT and HUMINT in Russia, which apparently is so good that they are gaining some very specific information that is timely. A lot of the light aircraft routes that the Ukrainian drones are taking, they're changed every 48 hours. And they're changed once a Ukrainian suicide drone has passed through. And this is meant to just not shoot down their own plane. There have been 3 cases already where light aircraft pilots have been targeted because of the shape, because of their position, so forth and so on. So as I said, you have one side who is losing badly, another side who is not advancing, and the joke is that the side who is losing badly, especially the air war, the long-range strike war, is trying to give to the side who is winning it, although in empirical fashion, a chance to not win it by stop the most acute asset that they have. And in this case, it is the UMPKs, the Su-34s, the cruise missiles, the Shahids, and of course, the other funny stuff that they throw at the Ukrainians beyond 400 or 500 kilometers. This, of course, as I said, this is not going to fly. It makes no sense for the Russians to stop that. They would just suicide by doing that. The situation is not going to change that much, but it will for sure allow the Ukrainians to have a breather if they do not get 120, 130 UMPKs per day. And then let's start. Like, one of the things that they start with is, while the length of the front and size of Russian ground forces may give the impression that the task is infeasible, in our view it is practicable if European nations are willing to pay the cost. So first of all, you got the huge caveat, willing to pay the cost. What is the cost? You're going to see that later on, they are extremely funny and they absolutely do not understand what's going on in Ukraine. I have this feeling that these people haven't been punched in the mouth. And it's true because Westerners haven't been hit in Ukraine, even when the Russians could. It hasn't happened. Most of the time they are part of the Ukrainian army or National Guard or GUR, and therefore when they died, they just died. There's not much to be said there. Now, like with the right force balance, investment, and political framework, Europe could generate a credible commitment. And you're like, what is the commitment? And then they follow up. There is nothing fantastical about the European mission in Ukraine. France and the United Kingdom are considered such a proposal. And it's already a problem because, first of all, the Italians have said, Meloni had said, no thanks, guys, we're not risking that. The Spanish are going to do the same. But there is enough little trash in Europe to be able to grab at least one extra brigade. And you have to understand that the whole point here is to have a limited, quote-unquote, flexible force that would be backed, quote-unquote, by a huge AD system. We are going to continue because you need to understand the absolute crazy proposal that is based on the delusion that the Russians will allow them to come and not hit them. So this is just analyzing something that for sure the Russians will not agree to unless something huge happens. but also the plan for it is mindless. So Turkey may be open to contributing to such a force as well. Turkey is not going to do that. There is one thing that the Turks will not do, is getting boots on the ground in Ukraine because of three things. First of all, a very bad aftertaste. They still know what happened at Balyun. They will not risk that within Ukraine, because in Ukraine there will not be the major force. Recep knows that the maximum he can do is just annoy the Russians. But putting Turks there in Ukraine, I'm going to say it openly. First of all, it would be extremely funny to me as a Balkanic, because they occupied us for over 450 years. And therefore, it would put a smile to my face. I'm sorry to the pro-Russian Turks, to get them bombed again. It's not your place, guys. Just go fucking home. Syria is something different. If you manage to get within there, no biggie. But as much as the Balkans or the Ukrainian territory, soon to be Russian, it's not your place. Just don't go. It would make no difference to the Iskander operator to obliterate the fuck out of you. He will get actually a premium for that. A bounty. Now, we go on. However, the conversation remains ill-informed in terms of requirements, either implying that the token force will be sufficient or inflating necessary troop levels to a point that renders such policy impossible. This is not something ill-informed. This is exactly what Zelensky said. Zelensky started by 200,000, then he reduced it to 100,000. Of course, logistically, both six-figure numbers simply were not doable. And I've been over this. The Western European forces just do not have the logistic capabilities to sustain themselves that long with a smaller footprint, and this is coming, and being agile enough to just avoid getting their shit pushed through. They haven't fought the type of war both sides have been fighting. And once again, Ukrainians, at least into the medium and higher echelons, they understand what this war is about, how it is fought. Europeans, maybe the military has an idea, but the politicians for sure they don't. Otherwise, they wouldn't have made the proposal. And apparently, given the experts who are analyzing this, there is no understanding of the reality. And let's start bounding the mission. So NATO is more secure with Russia facing an independent Ukraine with a credible military. The problem is that Ukraine, in order to have a credible military, has to have a absolutely blasted economy and social tissue. Ukraine is losing half a million to 700,000 people a year, on top of the 6 and something million that fled by week 1. In order for Ukraine to have a credible military, quote unquote, the way it is built right now, Ukraine needs to maintain a military budget close to the one of France prior to the new law of military spending, which is about $40 billion. And it's not France. Yes, the territory is vast, but the population within the territory, in the best case scenario, is about 30 million. So proportionally, they are spending more than France. Actually, they would spend proportionally the amount that France is targeting in 14 years. There is nothing else to say. Just like think. And of course, there is a logic. There is a war. But this war shows that the capable Ukrainian military cannot be at 200,000 or 300,000 people. It just doesn't work simply because on the other side, the Russians, once the deep battle model failed for their own fault, they just reverted to an attrition mode, which is giving its results. So, and they recognize it. These guys, they recognize the size of Ukraine, the extensive front line spanning over 750 miles, 1,200 kilometers. It's a bit small, but whatever. Can lead one to presume that requirements for a force are beyond means of NATO European militaries. It's true, they are beyond. If the force needs to be consequent and also be able to actually impact the fire line and the line of contact. Yet what Ukraine needs is not a traditional peacekeeping or separation force which has to be stretched along the line of contact. As such, it's not about the size of the front. And then you understand what it is about. These guys, they're not thinking about a peacekeeping force. What they're thinking is about, quote unquote, a elite, well-trained, well-equipped tip of the spear that would be the new fireman brigade. The same way they're using, as I said to you guys, Azov, 47th, whatever. With the advantage that, given it is a NATO force, or at least with NATO members, hitting them would risk triggering Article 5. But once again, I'm going to repeat it as I said, Article 5 has a huge issue. If you put yourself into harm's way, in this case, if you just fucking get into Ukraine without being invited and become a co-belligerent, Article 5 means shit. You provoke the situation. And of course, it also means shit who provoked what. If the guys want to activate Article 5, so be it. But then you know what's happening. We all need super polarized glasses. And that's it. That's that. But in this case, we got another problem. Because you have to read the piece. It's amazing. So the force would serve two functions. First, assure Ukraine with Western backing. Ukraine should be able to maintain a force sufficient to man or patrol key sectors of the front line. Second, enhance deterrence against future aggression from Russia through both the capability deployed and the inherent risk of directly engaging Western forces. And I'm like, the inherent risk of engaging what? Once again, the Iskander operator is just gonna fucking have a bounty for killing you. It will make no difference. And given how America is reacting to that, it's a clear sign that the Americans want peace. They do not want the war to escalate, not because they cannot win it or cannot stand it, but simply because a war in Europe right now would simply get out of trouble China when it comes to Russia, and a escalation would free the Chinese hands through the legal international system. You invite yourself in Ukraine, you become a co-belligerent. You cannot speak about peace. So for the Chinese, the whole idea of bowing down to that pressure and having the Europeans entangled in there is an absolute no-brainer. First of all, you get to actually invest in an economy that is going to grow, at least for 10 years, which is the Russian economy, given that it will be forced to confront multiple foes. But on top of it, as I said, the loans, the investment, and everything are going to target a direct competitor in the global market. Is it going to be nice and a fairy tale for the Chinese? Of course not. Because China still has a huge interest in exporting and using the European market for what it is, a cash cow, an import cash cow. But war is a matter of expenditure, blood, treasure. So for the Chinese, if it takes them to triple the trade with the Russians, and via to still sell enough components and shit to the Europeans in a way or another, why would they bother? Yes, the Chinese would like this not to escalate, but it doesn't seem so. The Europeans, and that's the point that I'm going to make about the Chinese, they understand that now the Europeans are on an ego trip, which is they consider themselves infallible and their principles untouchable. But that's the fucking problem. There are no principles in here. The Chinese completely understand what's going on because they are suffering from that situation. Because the Europeans, under the disguise of various nonsense, for instance, against Russia, for a long while, the Europeans have played a consumer protection game. Why? I'm going to explain to you. When it came to the terms of trade between the European Union and Russia, when it came about the gas or oil, the Europeans were the losing party. If you check the surplus exchange, you could see that the Russians were milking the Europeans. Not because they wanted so, because they were guaranteeing them a market price, and in some cases lower than the general market. But the Russians didn't need to even try harder to sell everywhere else. And on that, where initially the Russians had the leverage, slowly the Europeans woke to that and just turned it around. And suddenly, the principle of the consumer protection, consumer rights, in this case being able to negotiate a bulk purchase on Russia and not individual contracts, was leading to this worsening of the terms of trade. Because once you have a cartel of buyers, whereas you are interdicting a cartel of suppliers, then you're breaking your own rule about the cartel. But the point is that for the Europeans, it's not a cartel of buyers. It's a bulk purchase in order to give the better price to the consumers. While in reality, it's just an attempt to pressure the prices on the low. Are the Europeans doing the same for the products they were selling to the Russians? No. If you see, the industrial index on European countries has gone up. The prices for products, especially finished products delivered to the Russian market, was going up, and there was no explanation about gas or oil. It is something that Europeans have been doing since they launched their industrialization. And that situation went awfully wrong, both in the US, where the US simply stole their fucking patents, especially the Brits, and started to have its own industry, but also against the Chinese. The Chinese had a very mercantilistic approach, and they were simply making too much money. The terms of trade with the Brits, for instance, were negative for the Europeans. And therefore, the Brits tried to find a way to upend that, and also try to have a casus belli in order to intervene. The opium wars are not about opium. The opium wars are about a pretext and also a huge endemic situation with the opium being a absolute plague for the Chinese population. That would simply open China and allow the Brits to reverse the terms of trade. So if you hear about this, like, what the fuck is he saying? What is this about consumer stuff? The consumer part is just a fig leaf. The reality is that they want to pressure Russia to sell its resources cheaper in order for them to keep the upper hand technologically. And unfortunately for the Russians, its next step, which was to, sell abroad to other customers, lands it straight ahead to the Chinese. And the relationship here is even worse because it's 1v1. You have the Chinese government, the Russian government. And the Chinese, at this point, for the moment, have this technological advantage over the Russians, mostly due to the size and mostly due to the fact that there was a 40-50 year investment from the West to this huge market in order for them to also milk the Chinese. So the product of this trade situation, this market situation, and the future product of it, so China versus Russia, they're finding themselves to have a common goal, but also a common logic. And the whole point where the Europeans accepted to play into the siphoning from Ukraine from 2003 to 2007 is exactly that. For the Europeans, the gas flow between Russia and Ukraine was a perfect situation. If I was a believer in conspiracy theories, I would say that the Ukrainians were pushed to do that bullshit, despite the fact that they had a way better price than the Europeans. And that's how they came to the idea, due to they had to take a specific volume, even if they didn't use it. That's how it went to the idea that, oh, well, we have this gas that we are forced to take but we cannot use. Well, we're going to sell it to the Europeans. But given the fact that they couldn't touch their own reserves, they simply started to, siphon gas from the sales towards Europe. And that siphoning wasn't for them. It was pure resale. The volume actually was just slapped with a lower price and then resold. This was the accusation that the Russians laid out to the Ukrainians in 2003. And suddenly that accusation starts to make sense. The Europeans against Russia weren't there as much to threaten it militarily. The point was to finally put a leash on the Russian bear by hitting it on its wallet. The third worldization of the Russian state via this approach was obvious. And it was further helped by a certain logic of fealty from some Russian, both oligarchs, but also leadership heads. At no point much of the Russian economical elite decided to break bonds with Europe, or at least try to change the whole logic. Their kids were in Europe, their money was in Europe. The Russian money itself, the Russian central bank invested massively in Europe. We have the situation that we have with the frozen assets for that. So this interoperability and this codependency, from the Russian point of view, was the way to, guarantee that we are, cooperating up to a certain point. We are part of Europe. But the problem with that is that the Russians at no point had any kind of illusion. But the money is the money. Pecunia non olet. Now, fast forward and through the last 15 years, so roughly after 2008 until now, you can slowly see and you can see how the pieces of makeup on the European whore are falling apart. From the beginning, Europeans haven't forgiven the Russians for keeping that much of land after World War II, despite the fact that they lost, quote unquote, the Cold War. Americans didn't want to fucking bother with it because it's a huge landmass and they would have to deal with this kind of dinosaur slash Godzilla, which, if you try to take it apart, can blow in your face or can come together. And then the instability that it might cause, especially being so close to Europe, could have spiraled everything out of control. So for the Americans, what they wanted is a Russia that wasn't a peer competitor anymore, but they didn't want it to blow up. For the Europeans, from the beginning, it has nothing to do with blowing up or not. What they want is to keep the Russians under their thumb. The Germans, despite the fact that they collaborated heavily with the Russians, now you start to scratch them. You hear the Merz, the Scholz, the Barenbock. The Germans have not forgiven the Russians for beating them in World War II. It's as simple as that. And this aspect completely predominates the thinking right now. Up to a certain point, I was thinking these guys are just doing America's bidding. But America changed right now. And they are still following the steps of an American power that isn't there anymore. And this is your main issue. Then you need to ask yourself, why these people, despite the fact that now they have a completely different approach from the US, which is their benefactor and their pimp, why do they keep this antagonism going, whereas this was the approach of the previous administration? Why would you do that? I mean, where is the problem? Why don't you accept that, okay, you cannot ply the Russians and then it's better to have a small loss and, start again, start anew, than have this absolute nonsense of a blockade trying to kickstart Cold War 2.0. But this time you do not have the cards to do it. This time the economic system in the world is one and only. And the holes that you're going to try and plug from where Russia is going through to avoid the sanctions, trouble, and the dead ends are too many to block. So now we are finally, at least for 2 or 3 members of the European Union, back to the point where the Europeans have never had a chance against Russia, which is war. So, now, with Western backing, Ukraine should be able to maintain a force sufficient to man patrol, as I said, second-hand deterrence against future aggression through both capability deployed and the risk of directly engaging Western forces. We spoke about this. This only hinges in American guarantees that they would back them, given that for the Article 5 to work, you need, the big boy to be agreeing with that. And the multinational task force division does not need to be everywhere in Ukraine. It needs to have a presence on 3 directions and with sufficient mobility to redeploy as necessary along the front. This is madness. And I'm going to explain you why it's madness. Because it goes back to the exact same way that Ukrainians are using their firefight brigades. as I said, be that Azov, 54th, whatever you want to call it, these people are just dumped anywhere to plug gaps. Essentially, it's also about Ukrainians seeing that they have a future and that in the event of another Russian invasion, they also have a chance. Let me be more than honest. How the hell are you going to have a chance if you are forced to first abandon your winning ways, quote unquote, have a ceasefire, and then Troy horse NATO into your territory under the guise of a peacekeeping force? This is delusion. I'm not saying that's not going to happen. If the Brits and the French want to suicide, what the fuck can I do? In a certain sense, what Trump can do about that, what Putin can do about that. It's clear now, as I said, these people are not sane anymore. There is no more logic. There is a butthurt ongoing. And there is something, as I said, akin to realizing that the Russians have committed a crime of lèse majesty by daring to win a war against Europe in Europe. We are back to mental imago that honestly I thought was gone. Because it's literally them looking at the Russians as Bantus or Mongols or whatever. A European commitment will also help avoid the worst case scenario after any ceasefire in which Ukraine sees itself abandoned without any security commitment or Western military presence. There will not be any Western military presence after any kind of peace, because the whole war was for them not to be there. So there is a very little chance that the Russians agree to have, as a result of this, if they are forcing Ukrainians to sue for peace, the exact opposite. And this is where the delusion keeps going. So, the force may need to grow over time as Russia reconstitutes. This would amount to perhaps 15 to 20,000 personnel in country, with another 30 to 40,000 required for sustained rotation, for a total of 45 to 60,000 troops. Okay, first of all, this kind of troop commitment might be extremely possible, but simply not right now. As you may know, and this we know thanks to the Germans, in order for any kind of expeditionary troops of both France and the UK, they need at least 30 days at the battalion level and the brigade level. But the Germans say that it's a lot longer, actually. It should be around 90 days. So even if the peace is agreed in next month, I know that there is a deployment in Romania, another in Baltic states, and other shit in Poland. But the only way that it would work, as I said, is they crossing through Romania and entering Ukraine at the worst place possible, which is around the Odessa area. There's a huge choke point, and if things go wrong, if the Zatoka bridge is blown, they will have only 3 passages, well within Iskander range, and that could be funny, especially if they try to sneak in. But the problem with this is that they say divisional headquarters, 3 vulnerable brigades, a logistics brigade, and a fires brigade. Conversely, nations could set up their own national support element in place of a logistics brigade. So, this part is why Kursk failed. If everyone does what they want, it's not going to work. On top of it, smaller nations have less potential. So what are they going to do? Denmark, for instance, still needs to get his fucking Israeli howitzers if they want to do anything in there. On top of it, aircraft probably are not going to be stationed in Ukraine, which means that they're going to have to fly from across the border, of course, but that makes them co-belligerent, and that infects the border as well. For instance, in the case of Romania, if aircraft fly from Romania and try to bomb Russian troops in Ukraine, we are not even discussing this proposition. There is nothing logic in this. But it's okay because worse is to come. So this effort also envision moving the multinational interflex training mission for Ukrainian troops currently running in the United Kingdom into Ukraine. Britain's Second Security Force Assistance Brigade, which is the unit at the core of that effort, should also be deployed. And you're like, you have a huge problem. First of all, because the moment you intermingle with Ukrainians, you become a target. No problem. There is no issue there. You forfeit completely your peacekeeping role. You are not a peacekeeper anymore because you are a co-belligerent. You are sustaining that force. From the beginning, it has been like this. And once again, go to the United States Manual for Law of Warfare, and you will see a co-belligerent is anyone who assists one of the parties. It doesn't matter in what capacity. You could literally just offer blowjobs, and you could be a co-belligerent. And that's it. Now, European leaders may worry what will happen if this force is engaged by Russian strike capabilities. There is a somewhat fraud discussion at present about the need for robust air defenses. And then they come. Yet the war has shown that dispersal is highly effective. As entrenchment and Ukrainian air defense, much of it Western systems, intercept a significant percentage of Russian strikes. This is coming 2 days after the ground at Cherkasy in Dnipropetrovsk was fucking pelted by cluster ammunition. This also comes after 3 years when the Ukrainian air defenses, despite being Western, failed to intercept a significant part, the same way they intercept a significant part. And because we know the statistics thanks to Siersky, we know that the ballistic missiles are not intercepted mostly. And what happens with ballistic missiles, they go very fast, they go very far, and if they catch you with your pants down, you're getting fucked. And then you have, if anything, the experience has illustrated that air and missile defenses are more effective than expected, while a force that is properly dispersed is a very unattractive target for precision strike systems. They literally send an Iskander to a single book. These people are not watching this war. These people also do not seem to understand that for 3 years now, they laughed at the Russians' face. They laughed at them. Oh, we're killing you with 5% of our budget. Guess what, motherfucker? The Abrams became a fucking prize. The Leopards became fucking prizes. The F-16. Everything Western has more value than 1 million dead kikils. Because it's the best PR that the Russians can ever give to anyone else. So you're functioning with a huge system that places a big emphasis on public relations by showing dead Russians, gore on Russians, burning Russian carcasses. And now you are within range. How the fuck can you say that a properly dispersed Western force is not going to be worthy of taking a couple of Iskanders into the face? This is something that only retards can write. and then say, oh, this is perfect, this is exactly what I wanted to say. There are 3 years when these people want to skin you alive, and then you give them the opportunity. And it's not a small one, it's not a small, token force. You're speaking about 15 to 20,000, which is at least a couple of dozen locations with at least 100, 200 people. And because you're obnoxious, you are not gonna fucking conceal and entrench yourself. You are gonna be worse than the crops, which means that you're gonna be an even easier target. A multinational force could manage its footprint in country to make itself a hard target in much the same way as hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian troops do every day. Yes, motherfucker, 130,000 are dead. 130,000 are dead. Over 100,000 are maimed. They all tried to make themselves unattractive. Over the course of 3 years, we have had at least 35 mass casualty events due to long-range strikes. The latest, I would not burden yourself with where it was. So what exactly is this fucking nonsense? Sustaining its presence in Ukraine would mean that European nations would have to revisit existing commitment to rapid reaction forces and those made on NATO regional defense plans. But Europe has the capacity to do this, and given the recently made pledges to increase defense spending, yes, motherfucker, increasing spending doesn't mean that these troops are going to be popped out overnight. The whole logic of this, and this is what's madness, is that the defense spending that has been spoken about will take 2 to 5 years. And if you go out there and say to the average European youth, bro, would you like to enlist in the military and potentially be sent to Ukraine? Just hear the fucking answer. I don't think you're gonna like it. However, this mission will be under European rather Ukrainian command. There we go again. You're gonna split the command and you're gonna have a completely different approach. You are going to cosplay the Anna in fucking Ukraine. You are going to try and have a separate command and control system against guys who are known to lie about their own losses, who are known to lie about their failures, and who fucking have a culture of corruption. This is, and I'm sorry for a very specific friend and member of the TWK, this is trying to do Uzbin on steroids. So far, European leaders have not been prepared to match their rhetorical commitments with resources. Notably, some nations with significant military capability like Poland appear to be reticent. Of course they appear so, because a good Polish is a dead Polish in fucking Ukraine. You are trying to not understand that the biggest yappers in this fucking war, the guys who have been blasting everybody with, we're gonna activate Article 5, we're gonna nuke the Russians. Oh, you're so shitty, we're gonna own you in 3 to 5 days. You think that the Russians are not gonna lean on the Poles? This is the best part of it. This is like Kursk. Instead of running behind these guys and trying to avoid conflict, you got them finally where you wanted. And you're gonna just fucking pelter them with whatever you have. This is the whole fucking problem here. It seems that these people do not understand that it's been 3 years that they have been killing Russians for no good reason. Nobody killed Poles for invading Afghanistan. Nobody killed Poles for occupying Iraq. It wasn't the Russians giving free candy to Iraqi or Afghan insurgents. It would have been fun, actually. And we hope that the next adventure from NATO yields pleasant surprises. If possible, narco-style ventilation, FPVs, hate drops, stuff like that, you know? Turning tables on that shit. But that's the fucking problem. These people do not understand. They are sociopaths. They think that what they're doing is the right thing. They don't understand that it doesn't matter that you think it's right or wrong. It matters that you hurt someone. So that one, right now, the whole point in his life will be to take you for a payback role. The lack of self-awareness in this article is disturbing. There is a degree of fretting about the impact of such deployment of NATO deterrence posture. However, frontline states should avoid engaging bigger the neighbor politics when it comes to European security. Brother, it's not European security. There is nothing to do with European security. You have started to make this whole bullshit about when they're going to win in Ukraine, they're going to enlist all Ukrainian males and send them to fight in Europe. It makes no sense. That country has been gutted. The Russians themselves have been taking losses. The whole idea that suddenly the Russians are going to start taking chunks, well, it would have been a lot easier to start with the Baltics, and then you would have also the NATO fucking conflict right off the bat. And it made sense, because then you could go over to Finland, smaller country, although it is well armed, quote unquote, smaller country. A good strike campaign in Finland would yield you a lot more damage than a fucking 3-year campaign in Ukraine, simply because Ukraine was overbuilt with redundancies everywhere. And it's huge. A European mission, Ukraine need not come at their expense. So, on top of it, Europeans would have to foot their own bill, which is logical. I mean, you want to intervene, you pay. But the issue is that if the Russians are paying for their forces on a budget of about 150 billion a year, the cost for the Europeans of a whole year of presence, although it is reduced and everything, would be probably not far from the 50 billion. Which is %82 of the French budget, voted for 24 to 30. This is an extra commitment. And this, without doing anything, just being there and making their war face. If there is the war, if they start taking losses, there's destruction and to reproduce stuff, it's going to cost even more. And suddenly the good idea will be an absolute nightmare financially, first and foremost. The risk of inaction is much greater for Europe than the risk inherent in deploying a force into theater that could be attacked or otherwise challenged. Actually, this is a lie. The risk of inaction. There is no risk of inaction. Nobody wants you to fucking move. You are there to just shut the fuck up. If you wanted to intervene, you would have started right off the bat. Not now with this nonsense of 15,000 that would be quote unquote peacekeepers, but actually would be involved in the fighting right away. The whole idea, structure, thought process of this article paints this force as an intervention force in order to alleviate and train the burden from the Ukrainian military. And it's logical. We know why. Team war criminal autists have already told you. The Ukrainians are getting to the bottom of the barrel. They're not going to be without men. It's simply the pool of people that they have is going to be worse and it's going to shrink. And one first admittance of this was that they stopped expanding into new brigades, but they wanted to consolidate what they had. And I told you, once you start to consolidate, you put brackets, which means that that's the maximum you're going to have. You can replenish brigades and have them a lot more battle ready, but your maximum is limited. If you want to grow, you have to have extra brigades. That's it. And of course, I know, given the type of brigades that the Ukrainians have been fielding with 1.6 and 2.5, if you have every single brigade at 2.5, then yes, the amount of people would be greater. But the structure of those brigades would mean that you would do the same mistakes as before. We spoke about this. You will have to fill at them. Because dropping a whole brigade on the front, given how it's going right now, just risks the situation where the whole brigade is going to get decimated. And we've had that multiple times. Some brigades even had 1,000 people just missing overnight because they didn't want to die. Now, managing contingencies. Questions will dominate discussion over whether to pursue such policy is what happens if Russia attacks Ukraine. Well, first of all, this is nonsense because you need the ceasefire and Russian acceptance first in order to bring these assholes in. But the deployed force would not be protected by NATO Article 5 and would not have the backing of the United States. Guess what? Then you're fucked. Because everything in here hinges on NATO doing something and the US backing them up. First, in such scenario, the mass of the force would be provided by the Ukrainian military. And you're like, what? The goal of this proposal is not to shift the burden of deterrence and defense from the Ukrainian military onto Europe, but to enhance Ukraine's existing capability. Once again, I told you guys, we're not speaking about peacekeepers. It's just an attempt to sneak in a new blood, given that you cannot expand the Ukrainian military as it stands in a short time span. It's very funny. Because these people take everybody else for fools. Whereas the Ukrainian military lacked an effective higher echelon of command, struggled to train its force, or coordinate fires beyond 30 kilometers during the current conflict, mentoring by European militaries could significantly strengthen aspects of operation, such that Russia would be dealing with a more capable and integrated force. I give these people 2 weeks under optical fiber. Two weeks. I do not think they're going to like the results, especially as I already made the point. If you see what's going on the last 3-4 months with the Ukrainians at the front, you do not want to talk about this shit. The second critical aspect of the force credibility would be the contribution of European air power. The Russo-Ukrainian war has demonstrated that it is possible to overcome Russian air defenses. The problem has been the scale at which such operations can be conducted and the limitations on Ukraine's ability to exploit the gap it creates. There is no limitation. The problem is that the whole point is that the Ukrainian Air Forces got creamed the first year. The first year, the Ukrainian Air Forces lost over 97 planes, of which over 70 were fucking jet fighters and bombers. Ukrainians are being limited because they have to fucking play hide and seek. And their scores, especially 2023 and 2024, all Russian jets were mostly striking them on the ground or setting up ambushes with extreme persistence, which then they would lose to a subsequent cat and mouse game that would have to play with the Russians. Europe has modern fleets of combat aircraft. Only a sliver of its capacity is used for current air policy missions and out-of-air deployments. Okay, so if you want to use your air fucking force, where are you going to drop them? The whole point of this, I'm going to repeat it, the whole point of this is that you are not fighting against Iraq. If the Americans are not there, your air wing mostly, let's take Poland. Poland has a fucking air wing of 90-something planes. It's barely bigger than what Ukraine was. Maybe it's more able in a certain aspect. Take France. Fuck, even take Germany, but Germany is in dire state, so what the fuck are you talking about? Anything that you're gonna fucking try and do would have to be going through limits of countries which are not gonna be far enough to avoid getting hit back by Russian systems. And the moment you're gonna escalate and gang up on Russia, then you're gonna have fucking mushrooms going up. You would be striking first. You would lose the logic of self-defense. I'm going to tell it once again. If you are going for a decapitation strike, a mass strike against Russia, this cannot be treated as some kind of answer, because the planning for it would delineate intention. And you're going to say, who the fuck cares? Once it's gone, it's gone. Once it's on like Donkey Kong. And I agree with that. The point is that on the legal aspect, you cannot defend it as whatever you want to fucking do. So therefore, you getting hit by any kind of strike as retaliation by the Russians, including nuclear, completely fits within the Russian nuclear policy. As simple as. It will be objected that European Air Force currently lack the training, munitions, or command and control infrastructure to execute such operations. This in some cases is correct. Initially, US support may be necessary when it comes to logistical or organizational capability. Well, but addressing such glaring set of deficiencies is vital to restore NATO's conventional deterrence posture, and it is a solvable problem. So basically, it's not going to be solved within 3 to 6 months. So what are we talking about? Within 3 and 6 months, if the pace keeps going the same, you're going to be in the position when you don't need peacekeepers, but you would need an intervention. And once again, once it's an intervention, you have another problem. You are not protected by anything. You are co-belligerents, mushrooms, etc., etc., etc. And in a certain sense, Donald Trump would be right. You guys are playing with fucking World War III. What of potential Russian opposition? Depending on the mandate of the force and how this mission is framed, Moscow may accept it as part of my armistice. Like, just think about it. The Russians, which are waging this war for no NATO in Ukraine or no Ukraine in NATO, would agree to have NATO forces acting at best as a tripwire, at worst as an auxiliary force for the Ukrainian military. This is trying to sell ice to an Eskimo. It may happen, we've seen worse, but this is pushing it. So, then you see Sergei Lavrov has said, though, that we cannot consider any options when it comes to European peacekeepers ruling out. Hence, Russia may strongly object to such a force. It's not going to be a strong objection. It's going to be Iskanders to your face, hopefully nuclear tipped. And then you have the policy set as above, which requires significant investment and the political determination by European states that they were prepared to fight for Ukraine. It will also require prioritization, at least in interim, when looking at the current commitments. Strategically, there is a compelling case that it's better to prevent the subjugation of Ukraine than face an emboldened Russia elsewhere on the continent. Once again, there is no logic. Like, this is Schrodinger Russia, too weak to fight and beat Ukraine, but strong enough to take on the rest of the continent. So either the rest of the continents are pussies, or this is bullshit. However, current debate on this topic veers between vague security commitments without any reference to necessary force requirement and wild statement of troop requirements that make the proposition unsurmountable. Actually, they are not wild. If you want to see what Ukraine lost this year, without being a blind asshole, you would know that in case of this all-out war, whatever you want to fucking try to the Russians, you're going to end up with at least 100,000 casualties. So the expeditionary force from Europe would be depleted within the first year, and then would require a different kind of commitment, which means all-out war. And that's it. There is nothing else to say. And now we have a more careful examination of what it takes to demonstrate that it is possible. It will be costly in resources political will. This euphemism is fucking killing me. It's not going to be costly in resources because men are not resources. They are human beings. They are your soldiers. This kind of nonsense attitude to, okay, some people will die. This is literally the midget in Shrek, you know? And people don't give a fuck, actually. That's the funny part. They will never give a fuck because, as I said, they haven't been punched in the mouth. And to my surprise, I want them to do it. I want them to do it. I want them to do this shit. I was opposed to any kind of intervention, soft or hard, didn't matter, because in my mind this is gonna escalate and there is no way to fucking control it. But right now I want to do it because these people haven't been punched in the mouth. They need to get punched in the mouth to accept that they will go and discuss with the Russians over how much land they're gonna give up from Ukraine. That's the main fucking problem we have right now. And this shit is absolutely scary because these people, for now 4 years, 3 have already passed, this is the 4th, have given shit advice to the Ukrainian forces. And from the moment when the Russians couldn't be grappled easily, they couldn't be overstretched, they couldn't be gotten out of the rails, these people have advocated for the most cringiest and absolute crazy solutions. These are the guys who said, oh, attrition in 2024 is going to be great, guys. Keep going. 2023, yeah, there is a chance to succeed. Let's go. And more recently, as I told you guys, 2025, oh, we need to do all this shit because it's all good. A reform within the Ukrainian military. And now we have, oh, yes, let's go for peacekeepers. There is no talk about peace right now. People say they want peace, especially Zelensky. Zelensky wants peace so much that he's literally sabotaging everything. And I perfectly understand that the Russians do not want peace right now. Because they are having the upper hand, they are controlling the pace, they are forcing the Ukrainians to make mistake after mistake. But at any level, it's not just tactical, and it's not just a posture mistake, it's a strategic mistake after mistake. And the Ukrainians right now are forced to go after soft targets on long range and soft targets on a tactical situation. The raids on Toretsk, the attempts on southwest Pokrovsk, the upcoming alleged counterattack at the beachhead in Dvorichna, the attempts to now restart the operations and try and push them out of Terny and Polivka. Like, every single step reeks of retardation. There is nothing currently that Ukrainians can do that might sound funny to anyone. The whole article is just a form of impotence laid out on paper because it hinges finally in 3 points that I already discussed on last space. First and last point actually is American backing. If the Americans don't want to fucking follow you, you're fucked. The second point is that it clearly isn't speaking about the peacekeeping, it's there about an auxiliary European force. And it's not looking to have actually peace. What they're looking is to reinforce Ukrainians to keep going with the fight. And the third most important point, they are denying reality. So we have American backing, perfidy, and delusion. Exactly what Ukraine has been showing the last 3 years. Now you understand why the situation with Ukraine. These people have been having the worst ideas for ages, and they are actually counting on a forever war on the Ukrainian side with American backing. And on a certain sense, I understand, like, because like as a Balkanic and having a history of being occupied for a long term, I can understand the Ukrainian plight. Perfectly understand. The problem is that historically, in order to thrive, you need to not be a danger for your bigger neighbor. And sometimes it's not about appetite, it's not about controlling and invading, and sometimes it's really being scared that the tinier neighbor has access to your throat. Finland during the Winter War had direct access to St. Petersburg, to Petrograd, then Leningrad. And that explained why the Russians wanted them to cede territory, even swap land, because that's the thing that is never being said. The Soviets wanted to swap land. They wanted a chunk of Finland for sure, but they wanted to swap land as well. And I'm not going to say the proposal was good or not. It's not the point. The point is that in this case, Ukraine is being a threat to the Russians given the advancement of NATO and the legal prescription within the Ukrainian constitution of its future membership in NATO. And that's it. You cannot say anything else. You cannot pretend that you will not be a threat for Russia while being adamant that you will become a part of NATO. And as I explained to you guys, the issue with NATO is not as much that they're going to become violent from one day to the other, is that the system underneath it wants to control Russian resources. And as I said, they can disguise it in consumer rights, they can disguise it on fairness of whatever. They can disguise it on freedom and democracy. And for fuck's sake, Ukraine literally has people selling donated shit. They have still ongoing scamming outfits with huge call centers that work only to do that. And most of them are controlled by figures of either the state, either the fighting units within Ukraine. It's not complicated to understand the situation. And this article makes it even clearer. There will not be peace. The only peace that might happen, I'm going to repeat it, is a peace that both sides are not going to like, but Ukraine is bound not to like it at all. Because what they don't want overall is that fucking Crimean land bridge. That land bridge makes it impossible for Ukrainians to ever have a chance to break through. And certainly not with the demographic issues as they have right now. So this was the commentary. And you have to read the piece because there are some things that I didn't actually touch upon because we're into madness. There is a logic where fewer brigades employed by this alleged European force is going to have the better against the Russians because the Russians have been stagnating and absolutely reducing their capability and their value. And you're like, I'm not in the same universe as these people. I'm literally on a parallel universe or another reality because we are seeing the Ukrainians crying about the fact that now the Russian army is leveling the playing field when it comes to drones, when it comes to ISR, when it comes to advancement. But somehow, probably because of the donkeys, the Russian military sucks, you know? And they suck hard. Then, of course, you have to explain why your best operation in years, Kursk, is turning the way it's turning. Okay, guys, thank you very much for listening. And it was an impromptu space, mostly being triggered by this piece because it doesn't take into consideration anything that's real. But most importantly, it is showing a certain state of mind among a lot of people, which is insane, actually. There are a lot of people that I understand are hurt by the fact that their view, their vision, their dreams, when it came to this war, didn't pan out. And on both sides, a lot of people thought that it would be pretty short work, that the Russians would roll over the Ukrainians. That didn't happen. And a lot of people, once that happened, thought that the Russians would have had long, like they failed the first assault, they were pushed back, then Kherson, then Kharkov, and then everybody was 100% sure that 2023 was going to be the end of the war, because the Russians would see how futile it was and they would be defeated in detail. Well, that didn't happen. And then 2024 came, and then you had this small surge from the Russians, which sent everybody into panic, because it would go against the conventional wisdom back then. And even today, I mean, Bielitsky said that 2025, the offensive operations would not be along the Russian pattern, and he started to line up a bunch of nonsense about Russian quality getting lower, not having equipment, not having artillery. And I'm looking at satellite images of areas when obvious Russian artillery had worked. And it's funny because it looks like Russians have artillery and actually are hitting pretty hard. But, Ukrainians know better than anyone else, especially how to lose. Thank you very much, guys. We see each other probably next week. And as for questions, I will take either this Friday or next week. We're gonna do a proper Q&A, and that's it. I think I haven't done a proper Q&A in ages, but this time it's gonna be only Q&A. No specific subject. You can come and contribute, and we can have a discussion. Thank you very much. Have a nice day, guys.